Hello and welcome to VHTV, your guide to the talent, culture, and capital forces shaping the hard tech startup ecosystem. My name is Matt Jertson, the founder of Built, where our mission is to train the next generation of hard tech leaders how to build teams capable of solving the world's hardest problems. I'm joined today by Justice Killian of Space Capital. Justice, how are you doing today?
Hey, Matt, great to be here coming off of a little bit of a short family vacation. So feeling refreshed and excited to talk.
Excellent. Fantastic. And I'm also joined by Brian Major of Ad Astra Talent Advisors. Brian, how is the day going for you?
It's fantastic. Can't complain here in sunny Southern California.
Excellent. We have a really interesting topic to talk about today because we're in a really interesting time. The kind of the kickoff of the reason why we're talking about this, and then I'll broaden it out for a minute, is it recently became publicly known that you can't, in a very near future, like looking out at like 2028, so not that far away, SpaceX's rideshare program appears to maybe be going away, or at least you can't book rides on it. With that, there's also been discussion about Starship and how between the Artemis program and launching their own Starlink satellites, it might be the mid 2030s before they care about launching other people's satellites. And people are even starting to question, after the IPO and with all the other money that they're making, does SpaceX care about launching other companies' satellites and just providing that access to space? And ultimately, what this opens up is a discussion in the hard tech world of what happens when you have one player in a market have so much domain expertise and kind of they grind for decades, creating this massive technological moat. TSMC and shipbuilding would be another example. What kind of risks does that pose? What kind of opportunities does that pose to the rest of the market, right? Because it's clear in the launch industry, we've all been talking about how many more launches there are into space, but the price to get into space honestly isn't changing because it's still just one player that's doing all the launching. So I think what we wanted to talk about today, is just like what kind of dynamics does that face? Do we see it in other places in the hard tech ecosystem? Are we at risk of doing the same thing in other sectors? So I think that's where I'd like to start. Is are there other places where you've seen this kind of SpaceX story play out in the hard tech world that I haven't mentioned yet?
Well, you started to allude that TSMC is a really interesting analog, and I think you know they've publicly stated that they will not compete with the chipset designers that are their customers. And they've been true to that, as long as they've been in existence. They have this incredible technical moat, and that's created this entire new world of fabless production that's allowed, NVIDIA to achieve what it has, Apple to achieve what it has. But now in the last like 6 months, it's not only Google building TPUs, it's hundreds of different, chipset manufacturers that are building specialized computation designed specifically for the use cases and purposes that they're focused on. And that ecosystem is like clearly very rich and flourishing. And I think that is really a direct result of the path that TSMC has chosen to take, which is not competing directly with their customers. And, the counter example to that, I think you could look at I mentioned Apple on the chip on the silicon side, on the device side and the app store side, they're a great example where they created this incredible ecosystem, and over time they saw like what unique applications their customers were using. Anywhere from different like screen filters and tones like for night settings to heart rate monitors, and just over time they just slowly adopted that and basically ate the market of the customers that were leveraging their app store ecosystem.
Yeah.
Amazon's done this as well, right?
Yeah, you see,
Building
they're always charged with this.
exactly, using their compute and their platform and or their marketplace, and then literally creating direct competitors at a cheaper, lower cost price. And they've been accused of even like preferential search, relative to their customers. And so, when you own the market, when you own the platform, you have an unfair advantage if you choose to compete, right? And that's where TSMC has said, we're not going to do that. And it's created a rich, flourishing ecosystem. Whereas some of these other big tech players that own the hardware and the big CapEx and the sort of platform that underpins it have created sort of a unique, unfair advantage relative to the rest of the market to capture more value. So I don't know. I think it creates a real risk. If and the incentive, I think, is always towards that competitive nature. Like if you own the
Yeah.
market and your growth is the most important factor, in a business, and what investors are driving you to do, you verticalize and capture more of the value, which is what SpaceX has done, right? So
Yeah,
sorry,
absolutely. I mean, yeah, Brian, when you're looking at this, when you're talking to companies and they're thinking about what their critical path to market or what's going to be their differentiating factor, how are they going to survive in this market? What are you seeing?
Yeah, well, I think first zooming out and just taking a look at something else that makes SpaceX unique is that not only are they the dominant player in launch, they're also the dominant player in satellite connectivity and
Yeah.
satellite internet, and like could get there if data centers also become a thing in space. And so what that does is if they hypothetically stop serving other customers and only serve themselves, they will effectively like create I think too strong of a monopoly, and then they'll like invite more and more regulation. And so that's
Yeah.
why like we see SpaceX launching direct competitors is to not, I mean, I hope there's some goodness at their heart in that, and like truly like rising tide raises all ships. And like they know if they don't, like they will come under more and more scrutiny. And so I think that while they might be very strategic about how much they offer rideshare or Starship in the future, and that like I do think there is probably going to be more and more limited supply. I imagine they're not going to cut it off completely because I think they need to maintain some of that access for their own competitors, at least until
Yeah.
someone else is on the scene. Because I think the last thing they want is more and more um, governance and roadblocks. Uh, that said, the counter to that is now that SpaceX is also a publicly traded company, there's also this like instantaneous pressure to perform and have the bottom line look better. And so the best way that they improve their bottom line is not by launching their competitors or by launching satellites of any kind other than their own. Like the way they make the most money is by launching Starlink. And so they have this like tension of trying to service themselves with a priority and like serve their public themselves, their shareholders now being publicly traded, and also not being overly scrutinized as monopoly.
It's just incredible when you think about it. You think about what was that deal just before the IPO where they signed like a $30 billion deal to sell compute on their data centers, and you think about the level of overhead that it took to make that deal work, and compared to the level of overhead that it takes to get a $5 million payment for a ride share from one individual company or a university team. You just, yeah, as a publicly traded company, it's really hard to balance those things. But there's still that moat. I mean, I guess one question that I have is how how do we think there's are there how do we think and are there examples of getting out of these situations? I mean, justice, if some company came to you and said, TSMC is a monopoly, it creates an opening, we're going to build the next TSMC. I'm guessing that's way too, I mean, that's like a lot of money that it would take. Is that even a fundable venture? How do we move out of this kind of, out of some of these environments?
Well, I mean, it is happening in the world of Elon, right? Like we have TerraFab that,
Yeah.
is being, built domestically to sort of remove that reliance and bottleneck. But, TerraFab doesn't seem like I don't have our information that, isn't public, but it seems like they are existing to entirely serve the needs of SpaceX and Tesla
Yeah.
and their use cases,
Their
right? So it
demand is just
really
going to be
is
so huge. Yeah.
exactly. So it really is just another sort of verticalization step in the verticalization process. Um, but yeah, I mean, it is possible. I mean, it is possible to throw, more capital at it, but it takes sort of a force of nature to be able to do it, right? And to build out of
Mhm.
it. I mean, I think Blue Origin is a good example on the launch
Yeah.
side. It's taken a billionaire to be able to build, a launch company at some scale that could rival SpaceX. Then you have like the Chinese government, right? That is an alternative. And so what you might get is nation states, India has famously launched, satellites on the PSLV, as an alternative, when capacity's been constrained. My partner Tom, back in 2014, when there wasn't, SpaceX and the rideshare options, they had to launch their at Skybox Imaging. They had to launch their SkySat on a former Russian, ICBM, and
Yeah.
the complexity that it took to buy that, integrate, and get it to orbit. And so there are other options. It is a global ecosystem. There are more launch providers trying to develop, but it's just such a long road. That tech moat that you were talking about is, yeah, SpaceX is just a decade or more ahead of everybody else. I think the same is probably true with TSMC. Like they're just so far ahead that, by the time you realize there's a critical bottleneck and the market changes, whether prices go up or the, provider chooses to move out, it could choke off then that ecosystem. And it goes from this idea of a healthy, flourishing ecosystem where you have many different customers and many different applications or use cases developing to really, a handful that are capturing the majority of the value. And that's my biggest concern, with sort of SpaceX and the rideshare program. Like every launch that you see is literally it encapsulates the global ecosystem of innovation that's happening from research and development to new companies to small governments around the world, to even students and academic groups that are putting up new capabilities. And so yeah, you could look at it as the last 10 years have been, SpaceX has provided this almost out of like goodwill. And, the reality is, it's always been constrained. And now we're just realizing how valuable access to space was. Um, if TSMC makes that same decision, that could really choke, a lot of industries around the world, particularly AI. So I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot more happening on the launch side now
Yeah.
again, the last couple of years and in the few years following. Like we had this small launch vehicle boom and thought Blue Origin, and then eventually some others were gonna come along with the larger vehicles. And then there's this bust of all of those of so many of those companies. But now we're starting to see launch come back a little bit. And I think that it's because everyone's afraid of exactly this. Like we have SpaceX, we have Rocket Lab, and like kind of that's it. Like in the West. And like I think that um, even now, when you look at Blue and Relativity, it seems like they're probably going to launch themselves mostly. Like I don't know how much we can count on when those vehicles come online that they're going to serve anyone besides themselves as well. And so you see things happening. More and more launch vehicle companies starting to come up, like um, Cowboy Space is now like they want to do data centers in space. Well, they're going to also do the rocket because they know like they
You
can't
have to.
count on access to space. And then you have Canada wanting to have their own launch. And so there's a lot of effort going into creating multiple launch vehicles and competitions, like competition domestically within Canada to get their own launch services up and running. And so it's just fascinating to see how much is changing and how little you can rely on a single partner because like they control everything. And I think there is absolutely risk for folks starting companies counting on rideshare, counting on Starship, and you just have to be able to be more agnostic, and now so many companies are so threatened by that that they even are doing the launch themselves.
I mean, yeah, I mean, K2 is the example that comes front of mind to me. Is it's like, they started with a very clear business case that was reliant on, well, and I think Vast did too, where it was like the primary marketing was like, we're going to build the platform for Starship. And for various reasons, they had to, mainly because of delays, they pivoted so that they could continue to get to market faster. But now it looks like, well, who knows when Starship will be available for those other things. So yeah, it's interesting that dynamic of, and I can't think of a lot of times in history where that's been the case. It's always been, I think, different people made the plane and flew the plane, and different people made the railroad and then made the trains, and then like they were different things, different companies. So it's going to be interesting of how we get out of it. But to your point, Brian, I think at least on the launch side, it could be that it's very much a forcing function. It could be that talking here in 12 to 18 months, there's maybe just in the US 4 at least semi-reusable launch vehicles that are in the like Falcon 9-ish class that could be operating. And so maybe it's just maybe this is part of the market working, that it's creating that constraint and that pressure that then pushes innovation.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
if supply is so low, it's also what does that open up? Like, are people going to start like buying and selling and trading launches? Or
Mhm.
one of you, I think, was mentioning like more and more demand for companies to buy the launch and create ride shares. Like, what's going to be the solution here? Because I don't know that's going to go to zero, but if I don't think the supply will go to zero, but if the supply is so much tighter than the demand, and these companies need to launch, like how is the market gonna adapt to that? I'm curious what you guys think will be the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does create an opportunity for new companies to form to help solve that problem. If the hard thing, is SpaceX absorbs a lot of the integration and operational burden to make rideshare available. And like, the business case now is just getting so far. Like, that was an interesting and good business when they were, a billion in revenue, right? To add 100 million or, 20 million, like it was worth it, right? For them. And, now when you're talking, tens of billions of dollars for sort of one specific quarter, right? That's the magnitude of growth. It just doesn't make sense. So can you shift that to, a company that acts as an intermediary, like a broker that then manages the
Yeah.
integration and buys the full rideshare? Well, you'd have to have SpaceX willing to sell the entire rocket then, right?
Yeah.
And now the responsibility just shifts. I do think it creates, an interesting dynamic here where, like, will the market respond, or is this something that is so strategically important, for an industry, for an ecosystem, that policy says like, okay, if you are going to be a launch provider and we're going to, ensure that you have access to orbit, it's just mandatory that you provide 2 rideshare launches per year because that's what's necessary for a healthy ecosystem to continue to flourish.
Yeah.
And so I guess it sort of depends on which side you sit on. Like, is intervention and policy, and you spread the costs equally amongst like all the players, or is there enough of a functioning market that will allow, new companies to emerge to solve the problem? I don't know. I'm going to be paying close
Yeah,
attention.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's good. I wonder if that's a little bit what SpaceX is doing right now, is just like giving people some of that like tension in themselves, like what would happen, and feeling out like from policymakers, like what's the minimum we need to do to
Yeah.
to keep people off our backs. That might be part of the play right now.
Yeah, but it is interesting. It's yeah, as you said, just it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. It's just like kind of the past discussions that we've had around finance, and that the technology development is cyclical as well, where sometimes it goes faster, sometimes it goes slower, sometimes there's pressure, and then that releases the pressure. And what's that old phrase? It's like your profit margin is my advantage or something like that, and say, that's my way in. And so I think in a perfect world, these kinds of situations do build up pressure that are then lead to more innovation. Um, and if nothing else, there's that policy piece of, these are real strategic assets. And so it's just going to be interesting over the next few years to see how all that plays out. But yeah, I think we'll just have to wait and see where it ends. So really interesting discussion, especially as more launch providers come online, as Terrafab comes online. It'll be really interesting to see how this all plays out. So thanks for kind of exploring that a little bit with me.